Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us. My name is Dwayne, and with me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, we are back for another week to talk about comics.
Absolutely. It's been a good week of research and hanging out and learning about some of this stuff. These are some interesting years in the late 80s. So we're going to finish up with 1989, kind of look back a little bit on what happened during the 80s, see what this year a new round of Batmania can do to the comics world. And then, of course, we'll take a look to see how things are going for Marvel and for Daredevil, and just what exactly Inferno is, and did it affect the Daredevil comics at all this year?
Yeah,
Perhaps
I want to talk about that because that was crazy. I don't even really know what to say about the books that we're going to be talking about this week. It's kind of nuts. But before we do that, we did get some listener mail from our friend Mo talking to us about 1987. Said he wasn't, from what he remembered, he wasn't really much of a fan of the Marvel comics in particular in 1987. But he did call out, Dan, that he wanted to know about, even though we talk about Marvel a lot, but we do talk about DC. He mentioned that you haven't talked about Justice League and Justice League International as of yet, especially since Keith Giffen is an artist that has worked on Daredevil.
Yep, and of course, Giffen is a favorite of mine. I was, as an old Legion fan, his work on Great Darkness Saga and stuff like that is some of my favorite comics ever, really. That run with Levitz and Giffen would be in my top 10 favorite comic runs of all time, just because of how much I loved it when I was a kid. And this, I'm surprised we haven't gotten in more trouble with Mo and other folks for forgetting or just neglecting things they love, because there are so many books out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, the thing about those Justice League books is that they were interesting because they were kind of a new and different direction. Because when a lot of things were going grimdark and getting kind of more and more aggressive and the like, Giffen and DeMatteis took a more humorous and just sort of pure entertainment kind of look at the Justice League with these books, and then led into sort of a whole new era. We are going to be talking more about Keith Giffen this week, though. So, because after he started some of this, he actually also got in not only on one of the big crossovers this next year, but also on some radical changes to the Legion of Superheroes, which, spoiler alert, I'm not as big a fan of as I was of some of like the Justice League stuff he worked on. So, but yeah, he's absolutely correct. Those are key books from the late 80s, and I probably should have gotten them mentioned. But like I said, there's so many things that you could talk about that I think I've missed or had to take out for time. I can only apologize when I'm called on it.
He also mentions that to me that he hopes that I'm looking for Batman Year One, that I need to add that to my rating list because Frank Miller, David Mazzucchelli took the lessons they learned from Daredevil run and took it to the very next level. And I have to tell you, before I was a comic book fan, I was a Batman fan, and now I'm a Frank Miller, David Mazzucchelli fan. And so I definitely am going to try and get and read this because I actually was at the Half Price bookstore earlier today, hoping I could maybe find it. They did not have it. They had a bunch of Batman stuff, but not that in particular. So I'm going to keep looking for it, or maybe I'll get it at the library or something. But yeah, that is definitely something I want to look at.
That was from back in this. This was the time when I was selling things at like flea markets and things like that regularly, and so I think I still have 2 or 3 sets of year one. So worst case, I can bring them down to you next year. Get you some real copies at the next spring training. But yeah, it is fantastic stuff. Absolutely, well worth finding.
One other last note that he mentions was the split episode for 1986. We went really long because we had so much to talk about, not just on the comic book side, but also on Daredevil that year, that we ended up splitting 1986 across 2 episodes. And I think we're kind of debating about if that is something we should do more of. So I know, Dan, we were talking before the show. We wanted to get feedback from all the rest of you that are listening, people that regularly interact with us, people that just listen, whatever. We'd love to get your thoughts on whether or not you'd like to see more episodes where we split across 2, where one year would take 2 weeks basically to cover. First week with all of Dan's history of comics, both on the comics as a whole and Marvel side, and then the next week we'd more focus on Daredevil and then the takeaway for the year, like we did for 1986.
Yeah, and I think this is something where, when we started this, we had the idea that we'd start at the biggest level, and then we'd focus in a little bit on Marvel, and then we'd focus in a little bit farther on Daredevil, right? And I think it's worked overall pretty well. The only problem we have is that we just seem to be expanding like a balloon that is constantly being filled with more air. And so the episodes are getting longer. And there's part of me that's worried because I'm looking at, especially the next 4 or 5 years, and then also a lot of the stuff that goes on in the 2000s and the like. The number of books and the amount of things happening is kind of astonishing. So how do you do 1992 or 1993, in less time than we did 86? I don't know. So what we're wondering is what everybody thought of that. Is splitting some of these bigger years, or as we need to, into 2 parts, something we should look at doing more of? Are the hour-and-a-half episodes too long where you're like, well, I'd rather you just split all of them in 2 parts? Or do you like the way we're doing it, where we just have this sort of, contextualizing at the beginning with sort of the overview, and then we drill down into talking about Daredevil? So, any of you who have in the past sent us notes on Twitter or email or Blue Sky, we would love to hear from you on this as far as what you think. Help us kind of understand the direction we might want to take for the remaining 35 or so years of this podcast. It's not too late to change. We are not even halfway through this Odyssey, believe it or not. So
the 35 years we're talking about is the rest of Daredevil up to modern day. And then presumably we may move on to something else, because we've moved on to something else a couple times already. But it's, there's a lot that we could cover. There's a Daredevil TV show coming out early next year. At least that's the sounds of it. We definitely want to talk about that when that comes out. But we want to get your thoughts, and we want to make sure that this is something that you're excited to listen to every week. So we want to get as much feedback from you before we end up making a decision on keep doing it the way we've always done it, or potentially making some changes to how we've been doing things.
I actually meant 35 real years, Dwayne. And I'm still going to be making you do this in 2060 when I'm 90 years old.
Okay.
So just so you know, you're not done anytime soon. So.
Well, all right. With that, I think we shall move in and let's talk about the last year of the 1980s. We've reached 1989. We're going to be starting a new decade very soon, but we've got one more year left. The year in comics. All right, Dan, it's 1989. Where do we begin? Presumably DC's got something big going on, which is where we usually start when we're looking at comics as a whole. What is DC up to, and what does that mean for the rest of the comics industry, independence, that sort of thing?
Yeah. DC has a ton going on. A lot of other companies are struggling, but there's some out there doing some really cool things. Marvel is absolutely just throwing stuff out there. So we got a lot to talk about as far as comics. I wanted to note, though, that just kind of as a check on the culture, that 1989, where we're at right now, we get the introduction of the web browser and HTTPS, right?
Oh, goodness.
This is the beginning of the web, essentially. This is the first year Microsoft publishes Office. Almost nobody has a cell phone at this point. We are just ending the Reagan presidency and moving into the Bush years. Communism is falling in Russia. We're going from the Soviet Union to Russia with a lot of the things that are going on with that. Conservatism has been on the rise in America for a long time. You've got Thatcherism in England. So there's a lot of social unrest and things like that. A lot of people who are really worried about crime. Economic stuff has been changing. And in fact, there's a lot of things now with essentially corporations and the like starting to become ascendant. And with that, a lot more sort of social unrest at the lower levels. So you see things like Lex Luthor being rebooted as a businessman instead of a mad scientist. Because people are more worried about corporations than they are about nuclear bombs at this point. You get really the Kingpin sort of becoming ascendant in much the same way. Those two fill similar roles of sort of big bad criminal masterminds who also dabble in politics and essentially get themselves elected as mayors or presidents and things like this over the year in the various universe. But this is where a lot of that sort of stuff starts. And it's interesting because we're moving into a time where America's becoming almost more of a scared place in a lot of ways. And I think that gets reflected a lot in the comics. And in fact, when you're looking at the Daredevil comics of this year, there's an awful lot of, especially those first issues, that really shows just how much there's kind of almost like New York City is being displayed as this place that's a scary place to be. And the New Yorkers still are there and they love it. But it's kind of terrifying. And so it's amazing how everything does keep going through here. But it is also weird to think about. These comics don't seem that old. They seem like they could be modern. But when you look at the tech level in them and you look at the cultural levels in them, they're an absolute world away from our modern experience.
Very, very true. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. But yeah, while it does feel familiar, it definitely feels like a very different feel than where we're at now.
Yep. So outside of that, 1989, when we look at it from a cultural aspect, is dominated by the fact that Michael Keaton's Batman movie came out this year.
Yes.
Directed by Tim Burton. And you've talked about before that this is a movie you really enjoyed. I liked it. Prince demanded to do the soundtrack for it as soon as he knew it was going to come out. This was a big thing. It also was something that initially fans were terrified by. So a lot of your old school comic book fans, when Michael Keaton was the guy who was actually cast as Batman, they immediately went into panic mode because they're going to do another Bat Shark type of thing, right? Because
Adam West 2.0, basically.
Yep. Because he's like Beetlejuice and Mr. Mom and all this sort of stuff. And they had to come out and specifically, no, it's going to be dark. It's going to be gritty. The Joker is a psychopath and everything like this. And it's interesting because I think for the time it was relatively dark and gritty. Although, in retrospect, there's an awful lot of camp there, it seems to me.
Yeah, I was going to say they turned that up to 11 in that most recent iteration of the Batman. That's even dark and even grittier. But this, at the time, felt really dark, felt really gritty, and felt really just something to sink your teeth into. It definitely didn't feel camp the way Adam West Batman of the the 70s ended up being.
Yep, and they made some decisions there. Things like not bringing Robin into the movie, going with essentially a Batman who really, there weren't that many fight scenes in a lot of ways, and a lot of times he would like drop in, and it's more like you just see him there, and then the guy gets punched or whatever. There's not a lot of actual action scenes with the Batman, partly because I don't think that Keaton could even move his neck in the costume. It was more like he had to be craned into the scene, and then he would stand there menacingly and then be craned out of the scene. So in any case, it worked. I think most people, both at the time and historically, really enjoy that movie. You've got the Vicky Vale and all the rest. Kim Basinger did a good job. It all kind of worked.
Jack Nicholson is actually amazing to me. He is the Joker to me until for a very long time, and even I've grown to really love Heath Ledger as the Joker, and Mark Hamill doing all sorts of Joker in animated shows, but Jack Nicholson was amazing in there, and the way they made his origin story in there made sense. The way they tied in the origin of Bruce Wayne's parents getting murdered in there, it had an on-ramp for people that weren't familiar with Batman because they didn't get into the camp way back when, or weren't into the comics. But and then they ended up doing a couple more movies after that. But it was such a good film.
Yep, and not surprisingly, DC said, "Hey, maybe we should put out some Batman comics this year, just in case, right?" So
just in case,
we got a number of things, some important books actually. One of those books that's stood the test of time, probably better actually than when it originally came out, is Grant Morrison and Dave McKean's Arkham Asylum. It was subtitled A Serious House on Serious Earth, and essentially it's where the inmates of Arkham take a lot of the guards and other folks prisoner, and then demand that Batman be exchanged for them so that they can kill him. And it is a trippy comic book. And in fact, Dave McKean did like painted artwork inside it and everything. It's really interesting. They issued it in both a softcover and a collectible hardcover edition. And it sold a lot of copies. It made a ton of money. But I think Morrison or McKean, one or the other, said something like, we sold 200,000 copies and 199,000 of them regretted that they bought it. Or something like this.
Really?
So, I doubt that number is correct.
Why did he say that? Why would people
the reviews were not good on it. The reviews weren't good on it, and in actual fact, not a lot of people really dug it. And partly I think it's because it was kind of like an Elektra Assassin or something. It was a story that was so avant-garde and so sort of out there from what Batman fans were expecting and used to, that it just did not do it for them at all.
Gotcha.
So we also had Batman Year 3 by Wolfman and Broderick. So we'd had Batman Year 1, and then Batman Year 2, which wasn't quite as good, and then Batman Year 3, which surprisingly was even not as good as Batman Year 2, and then just keep moving. But it was still okay. I enjoyed Batman Year 3. We also had a new comic, a new Batman solo book called Legends of the Dark Knight. It was essentially brought in as an ongoing that was intended to have like 5-issue runs where a group of artists and writers would do a story about Batman, and then somebody else would come in and do one. And they labeled it the first new solo Batman book since 1940, and they sold 1 billion copies. This became the top-selling comic book of 1940, or of 1989. Because everybody is like, well, the original Batman #1 is worth thousands of dollars. I'm sure this one will be too. So
sure.
They were wrong. Just we also had a new Swamp Thing movie that came out besides the Batman movie. So it's called Return of the Swamp Thing. It was done by a director who mostly had done like some schlocky horror and low-level porn film type things, and then went back to doing those sorts of movies afterwards. It did not make any money at all.
I was going to say, I don't recall seeing this particular film.
No. The only thing cool about it, for those of you who might have been from the time, is that it did have Heather Locklear in it. So she is one of my favorite actresses of the 80s, and she actually was in this terrible movie. It's another of those, though, that if you like bad movies, it's worth watching just as a bad movie. So,
okay.
It's one of those that's bad enough to be good. So, outside of that, if we're talking about sort of other DC things, they debuted something called Piranha Press, which is a kind of a precursor to Vertigo. It was intended not as an epic, because they talked about how Epic was trying to take Marvel readers and basically hold on to them longer by giving them sort of the same thing, but a little bit more advanced. And like with Piranha, what we really want to do is bring in people who would never have read comics from the superhero genre or the stuff DC's doing normally. So they had a bunch of different things. I really liked Epicurus the Sage by William Messner Loebs, which was essentially about a Greek philosopher wandering around talking about Epicurean philosophy with all of the other philosophers in Greek times. And there's no action or anything else. It's literally just a guy wandering around.
that definitely seems a little different than your standard comic book fare.
Astonishingly, these books didn't make any money, and Piranha Press was canceled in like a couple of years. But still, Epicurus the Sage rocked. That year's DC crossover was called Invasion. Saw the Earth attacked by the Dominators, the Khunds, the Thanagarians, a bunch of other alien races. A lot of these had sort of a relationship back to the Legion of Superheroes, and in fact it was masterminded by Keith Giffen, who was doing a lot of Legion stuff at that time. Again, as I referred to earlier, Giffen also helped usher in what was called the TKM, or TMK, era for the Legion. It was the first letters of the names of the writers. At least half of this podcast team absolutely despises this run of the Legion. And I bet it's not you, Dwayne. So,
I'm unfamiliar with it, so yeah, I don't have strong opinions on it one way or the other.
So what I'd always loved about the Legion was it was a very hopeful look at the future, which you don't normally get in mainstream comics, actually. There's a lot of dystopias and a lot of, disasters in the future. And Legion had always talked about how there'd been a disaster, but that Earth had come out of it stronger and now was sort of this, this member of the United Planets, and things were generally relatively bright in the universe. Enough problems that you could still keep a team of superheroes busy, but nothing that was too terrible. This is very similar, actually, to the way Star Trek did things, where you've got sort of that whole idea that there is a period in Earth history where everything goes completely dark, essentially. And then out of that, a new civilization rises up. That's the one that eventually goes to the stars.
Gotcha.
What they did in this new reboot was they did a 5 years later era of the Legion, where at the end of the original Legion series, Legion Volume 1, they canceled it and then brought in a new one and said, it's now 5 years later, and the Legion's disbanded. The Earth has gone completely to crap and is like ruled by some sort of dictator, and everybody's in hiding, and essentially that entire bright future has been completely blown up. And the Legion now looks like every other crappy dystopian supergroup of the 80s. And so I was unimpressed. So, Mo, if you're a big fan of that Legion run, I apologize, but it was not my cup of tea. So, we also had Neil Gaiman and Sam Keith start up a new book called The Sandman under the direction of Karen Berger. This was not originally started up under Vertigo, although it becomes one of the main pillars of the Vertigo universe. They haven't got Vertigo yet. Essentially, this is one of the things that encourages them to create it. Keith is only going to last a few issues because he just can't keep up with the weekly grind. But they're going to find a number of other people who come in and continue on. This is actually going to run for 90 issues, become one of the most important non-DC Universe books DC's ever published. We also have another British import, Grant Morrison, who takes over the Doom Patrol. This Doom Patrol series is another one that is really trippy and weird. His idea is basically that this is a team of super people who all of them have some sort of a disability. Most of them are a little bit crazy, and because of that, the adventures they have are just going to be non-standard. And so everything about Doom Patrol is weird. Have you watched any of the TV show?
I tried to get into the TV show. I've watched like the first 2 episodes, and that was a while ago, and I haven't gotten back to it. So yeah, it's.
You sound like an awful lot of comic fans in 1989 after their second issue of Doom Patrol. So it did not sell very well, but because Morrison was doing so much other stuff and DC sort of believed in it, they actually gave it a pretty decent runway. But it was a very strange book. A couple more Batman things. Detective Comics actually hit issue number 600 this year. And sometime during the year, after we just killed off the previous Robin, DC decided they needed a new one because after they killed him, they realized there were a lot of like lunchboxes and underoos and stuff out there
sure.
that needed licensed characters. So Tim Drake actually is brought in as the third Robin. They do think a little bit about how to do it, though, and he, I think, becomes a really successful replacement. I know a lot of folks who are sort of a bit younger than me, folks who'd probably be in their 40s now. This is their favorite Robin by far. He is their Robin, and they really are big Tim Drake fans. So I think they did a good job with that rollout. Speaking of Justice League, we had some weird things going on there, because Justice League International now becomes Justice League America, not Justice League of America, which is what the original one was. It's the same Giffen DeMatteis craziness that we were having before, but they renamed it. And they renamed it because now there's a new book called Justice League Europe coming in, which is going to eventually take over the name International, but for now just made it make no sense that you had a Justice League International and a Justice League Europe. So they went back to saying we got America and we've got Europe. So the other thing we had is Grant Morrison, as well as doing some of the other things. Outside of DC, he did a book called St. Within's Day with Paul Grist, who's an artist who's really got a cool style that I like. It was for a company called Trident Comics. And you'll see that a number of these British guys coming over are going to find that their sensibilities don't necessarily allow them to be stuck in the Marvel and DC boxes permanently. So they're doing a lot of stuff for other companies as they go along as well. We have a new series called 8 Ball starting from a guy named Daniel Close. This is going to become one of the most lauded series of sort of the 90s. Close is doing stuff that is definitely not just your normal superhero stuff. It's published by Fantagraphics. It's one of these sort of more independent darlings, and it's going to get a lot of like best series stuff. And in fact, for this year, we'll see it wins best individual issue for one of its books. The Crow comes out from Caliber. You'll remember the Crow movie and all of the craziness around the Crow movie. This was the graphic novel or the comic series that inspired that. And then the last thing, as far as just a weird thing I saw, was to show you how long it's been that we've been dealing with this guy. In 1989, Robert Crumb already was doing comics about Donald Trump, labeling him one of the most evil men alive.
Okay.
And even then, he's like, you're so hateful. So Donald Trump has been angry and in the comics for what? 35 years? That's a lot of angry. So anyways, so Crumb had him pegged a long time ago.
That is actually crazy. And you've got a snippet of this.
It is available in the notes.
Right. So what does this mean for the industry? Does all this Batman mean that we're going to have knockoffs of that, or what are we seeing as a result of what's going on in the industry?
I mean, basically, the late '80s are nothing but a knockoff of Batman, pretty much.
I suppose.
Ever since Dark Knight, you've had the Turtles, which are basically an amalgam of Frank Miller's Daredevil and Batman run, and then everybody's been dark and menacing in a Batman sort of way, and it's only going to accelerate in the '90s. So, but what's going on in the industry? Time Incorporated and Time Warner merge, and that's going to be important because there's actually a lot more corporate control that comes in over DC at that point. It changes the way certain things happen and even which comics they're able to publish. We get a number of new publishers who do come in that are going to last for a while, including Caliber Comics, Innovation, Continuum, Revolutionary Comics, and Trident Comics. Most of them were relatively small, but they put out a decent number of books. We also had other publishers folding. Comico put out its last books at the end of 1989, as did Blackthorn and Renegade Press. Because of this, there were almost no small-ish, but not really small publishers. Dark Horse was just getting going. Fantagraphics, Eclipse, and Now had limited but successful years. And really, First Comics at this point was the only sort of mid-sized publisher that was putting a number of comics out into the market so that they would at least be able to take away a little bit of market share from the two behemoths. But basically, it's a Marvel DC world right now in comic books. So, one thing that did change, though, is in 1989, the Comics Code Authority redid the code again. And the changes they made essentially were to remove some of the barriers against... and the changes they made were to remove... Yeah. And the changes they made were to remove some of the limitations on usually depictions of violence or sexuality. Some of these are things that probably were important and needed to have been done and should have been done earlier, like previously you had homosexuality or any sort of reference to sexual preference or orientation, essentially put in the sexual perversion that is not allowed category of the code. Now that's been moved into a should be dealt with respectfully element, to essentially where you can have homosexual content, but you can't essentially be derogatory about it,
Right.
Other things they did, though, were things like removing limits on the depiction of rape, which may have been less, useful. In essence, they're trying to allow for a more accurate depiction of what actually is going on in the world. But one thing about this is you start to see that the code is no longer really there to protect children. The code is there to protect retailers. So it isn't what is safe for kids to see. It's what is it safe to be in books where we're not going to get prosecuted.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, if this is on my shelf, I'm not going to get sued by some random person because they don't like what's in there.
And even with that, the code is largely irrelevant at this point because almost nobody is actually using it.
Okay. So you've got here some of the top selling books.
Comichron has started. There's a point where Comichron doesn't have data, and I'd forgotten because but we're now back. They have data again. So, and then what that means is that there was a time in the late 70s and early 80s where nobody was reporting, and it was difficult to get real sales data. And so now that I see this again, it looks like the three top selling books, in case you're wondering, from 1989 are Uncanny X-Men, Batman, and Legends of the Dark Knight. So 2 Batman books and an Uncanny X-Men, which looks pretty much like every other year from 1975 to present, probably. But 2 Bat books and a mutant book, or 2 mutant books and a Bat book, is probably going to be what we'll see. So, also, the Eisner Awards evidently did not present in 1990 for books published in 1989 due to organizational changes they were going through. So, we've got the Harvey Awards for this year. And the Harveys are different because they are a little bit more independent. So a lot of the stuff they're doing is not just going to be, hey, the X-Men were great, right?
Right.
For this year, favorite writer for the Harveys was Gilbert Fernandez of Love and Rockets. Awesome. Favorite artist is Mark Schultz of Xenozoic Tales. I think this is a brilliant choice. These were books that were basically all dinosaurs, and he is a fantastic dinosaur drawer. So that was kind of cool to see. For cartoonist, which is essentially writer and artist, somebody who's doing both of them, they chose Chester Brown with his Yummy Fur. Inker, if you remember, I was singing the praises of our man Al Williamson. Evidently, I was not the only one, because they also thought that he was pretty fantastic. He wins this award, I think, 3 years in a row for his work on Daredevil from the Harveys. Letterer, Ken Bruzenak of Black Kiss, which is an interesting choice. He almost always does everything, or did everything Howard Chaykin did. He's got a very distinctive kind of lettering style. Colorist, again, I think I've mentioned that Steve Olive was hired, and he was specifically requested to be the person who would do this. But the coloring he did on Akira is fantastic, and he was actually given Best Colorist for that. For new series, they chose 8-Ball. That was also 8-Ball #1 was given Best Single Issue or Story. And for continuing series, they chose Love and Rockets. So you can see that the Harveys are wildly different from probably what the Eisners and some of the others are. So maybe we'll check in on them every once in a while, because I think it's kind of cool seeing how different they are.
Yeah, definitely. You've noted a couple passings that we should make note of in 1989?
I pretty much only want to deal with the Giants, because there's, going to be a lot of folks who've worked on comics who are getting a little older at this point. But C.C. Beck is one of the Giants. He died at 79. He was basically the, not creator necessarily, but the primary writer and artist for Captain Marvel for most of its early run before DC ran them out of business. And then he came back after DC took over the license in the 70s and continued to do Captain Marvel stuff. So when I think most people think about Captain Marvel, even though he's not technically the creator, I think he is the guy for Captain Marvel. Yep.
For that character. Gotcha. Okay.
And then Osamu Tezuka died at age 60. He was one of the formative artists and animators of the Japanese style. Created Astro Boy and a number of other things. And he was important over there for a long time. I think at this point, it's fair to say that Tezuka is incredibly important in America as well. This is a guy who has made a massive impact on American comics and animation.
Right. So before we move on and talk about Marvel, what was your favorite comic this year outside of Marvel?
So I'm going to go with Akira, which is technically Marvel, but it's epic, so I don't care. I've got another thing I want for Marvel. So Akira, though, was by far my favorite thing. It was what I looked forward to this year. Those books were so beautiful and just so well produced, and the story blew me away. I also really liked Zot and Miracle Man when I could find them, which was not always, because they were a little bit more difficult to get, and usually if I was able to get down to the comic store and pick those up, I did really enjoy those too.
The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
No, it's Batmania for DC. What is... I don't even know what Marvel can counteract with that. I don't know how you stop that locomotive from going once it leaves the station. So what were they doing this year?
So they really didn't necessarily compete with that. But what they did was flood the zone. So this year, Marvel published 167 different titles, as far as I can tell. That is up 7 from the previous year, which was way more than they'd published before. There's a bunch of changes going on this year, too. We've got a guy named Rod Perelman who buys the Marvel Entertainment Group itself, which is the parent company of Marvel Comics, buys it from the New World folks who had purchased it just a couple of years ago. He pays $82.5 million. He's kind of an investor type, so he himself only had to put in $10 million, and he got a bunch of banks to just fund the rest somehow, because that's what rich people can do, is just get other people to give them money, evidently. In doing so, he outbid Jim Shooter's group by about $1.5 million. And for good or ill, I think our story would have been much different for the next 35 years if Jim Shooter had bought this company instead of Ron Perlman. So the difference here is that one of these guys, Shooter obviously, would have been a comic book guy, and he had his own vision and the like. And he goes on to do some stuff at another place called Valiant and the like that shows he can build some cool superhero universes. What Perlman has is, though, that he is an actual billionaire. And he has the money behind him that when he decides to try and get some stuff done, he's got the power to actually put the money into it. Now, unfortunately, what the billionaire first did when he came in was said, hey, we should cut costs, and ended up firing a bunch of writers and sort of streamlining everything. So his preferred focus was on not building new properties, but instead on sort of focusing on existing characters who already had sort of like a name recognition on them, and working to build them into more marketable properties for movies and lunchboxes and all of this sort of stuff. And so that was essentially his direction, was we want to take the characters we have and make them more present within the culture so that we can then license them out into other areas. As part of this, because Epic Comics was a bunch of stuff they didn't actually own, and therefore Perlman could not do a lot to license, it was disbanded and actually folded back into the regular line as best it could be. Archie Goodwin, who'd been running Epic for the better part of the last decade, was not happy with what happened. He actually left Marvel over this and went to DC. Carl Potts ends up taking over what remains of the Epic line, those ex-Epic titles that get folded in. Many of them get truncated, many of them simply die, and some projects that were in process never actually get finished. For instance, there are 2 issues of William Gibson's Neuromancer, or one issue with the first 2 chapters. I can't remember which one. But there's an epic Neuromancer story that they started that they just never finished.
Oh, no.
So I wanted to get the end of... I don't know if you've ever read Neuromancer by William Gibson, but it's a really cool sort of early cyberpunk novel. And it would have been great to have this as a graphic novel adaptation. But they got about halfway through and it just died. Outside of that, we did have one Marvel movie this year. Dolph Lundgren's Punisher movie was released.
Oh, goodness.
You may or may not remember this.
No, I don't remember this.
It actually wasn't even released in the United States because they had some sort of licensing or other problems. So it made some money in other parts of the world, and then it was released eventually in the U.S. on VHS. It stars Dolph Lundgren. He doesn't have the skull shirt and a lot of the stuff, but it is actually not as awful as you'd expect. This is...
I expect it to be pretty awful, actually.
Usually if something is not released in its home region and it stars Dolph Lundgren, and it obviously doesn't get even the most basic parts of the character it's adapting right, you would expect it to be beyond terrible. And it's, I would say, borderline terrible instead, which is pretty about as much as you could hope for. Along with the movie, we had an expansion of black and white magazines. Things like a new Punisher magazine, something called The Destroyer, which adapted a bunch of old books, Conan the Barbarian, stuff like this. So a lot of the magazine rack books they were starting to put out, they actually expanded that line a little bit more. Those are the ones that, kind of like the Hulk magazine from back in the day, in that format and the like.
That's that. So, crossovers this year. You mentioned you teased it earlier. We had a crossover this year. It hit the Daredevil run. It's called Inferno. Dan, I don't know what the heck this was.
We did not have a crossover. We had 3 crossovers that basically spanned the entire year. So the main crossover you're talking about is Inferno. It mostly involves the mutants and New York, and the New York heroes. Essentially, demons invade New York City. The main character arc is sort of the corruption of Madeline Pryor, where she essentially goes bad, becomes the Goblin Queen, and then brings demons down. We also see the transformation of Ilyana Rasputin, who's Colossus's little sister, into what's called the Dark Child, which is essentially like a mutant/demon hybrid. She's the one that actually repels the attack eventually. But as part of that, then we have a bunch of stories where just New York is a mess. And that's kind of what you see in Daredevil. With weird things like, pop machines coming to life and eating off people's hands and just all sorts of weird stuff occurring.
I likened it to the short story that turned into the movie Maximum Overdrive by Stephen King when I was reading these books. Because, it was these inanimate objects suddenly kind of getting sentience and like attacking humans and like going around and making life miserable for humans, basically, for several months, actually.
And almost none of this is ever explained.
No, it's not.
When you're just reading these, if you weren't conscious of what's going on in the rest of the Marvel Universe, you'd be like, what in the heck is happening here? Because, as to the best he can, John Romita Jr. is essentially channeling Bill Sienkiewicz with a lot of this stuff, with just these crazy big mouths full of teeth and all this and everything. It looks nothing like a regular Daredevil story. And so, so we got like 3 issues of that. Then we have another crossover, Atlantis Attacks. This is actually only through the annuals. And it is one of the first crossovers that not only crosses over, but where you actually have to read all of them. So this is not just an annual crossover thing. It's one story going through 14 different books. So if you want to understand Atlantis Attacks, you really need to buy them all and read them. With Inferno, you didn't necessarily. We were reading Daredevil. It kind of made sense without reading everything else. In terms of Atlantis Attacks, you really needed to read all of them if you were going to bother. You didn't buy any annuals, or you bought them all. And then the last crossover was called Acts of Vengeance, which is focused more on the Avengers and Fantastic Four. And it was more of a standalone thing, where essentially Loki convinced a bunch of villains to go and attack people who they wouldn't normally attack. So they would switch off and attack other people's bad guys or other people's heroes, with the idea that then those heroes wouldn't know how to fight them because they're not used to their MOs.
And for that one, we did get an extra bonus issue in December this year for Daredevil that sort of completely just drops the idea that Dr. Doom needs to fight and destroy Daredevil.
Again, like he tried to back in issue number 75 or whatever. You remember when Dr. Doom kidnapped Daredevil and took him to his lair and changed bodies with him?
Yes, I did. That was...
You've been trying to forget, but now I've reminded you.
That was a thing that happened. So I didn't. So because Atlantis Attacks happened in the annuals, we didn't see any of that resonate with the Daredevil run. So I didn't even realize that was there. But beginning of the year we had Inferno that I think completely changed sort of how we pick up and deal with the rest of the aftermath of the whole Typhoid Mary story that was so good in 1988, which really kind of sucks, I have to say, in all honesty. And then we just had, random normal sort of stuff happening. and we're going to talk about it in more detail. And then at the very end, it's like, oh, we had a December issue. That's good. Now I guess I'm done. And then I look at the next issue. It's like mid-December, Acts of Vengeance. Here's Doctor Doom and Ultron. Because, sure.
I wonder if partly that's because of the whole Steve Ditko book in the middle. Where they had remember they had the one issue where they're like, by the way, John Romita Jr. is getting married this month, so here's a story? And it was just sort of like dumped in the middle.
Well, I mean, that was on top of the craziness of we just have this Inferno event that's going on, and suddenly we're going from a story that makes sense, that's really sort of tight and well written and well drawn and made sense, to now suddenly there's demons everywhere and inanimate objects are attacking people and everything looks crazy. And yeah, it just
Welcome
sort of
to crossovers.
Like, yeah. I'm not.
I suspect you're going to have opinions on this when we get to Daredevil.
Yeah. Okay. So they're like, we could do one crossover, but why do one when we can do three, basically?
Yes, I think that's correct.
Oh,
because they thought it might work. Now, one thing to note is that they did actually see the sales on a few of the main books dip when they did the crossovers. So I think they might have found that this is just excessive, and that the fandom was not able to deal with that level of interconnectedness and additional buying. But
sure.
In any case, other than that, we had a couple of top issues. Thor 400, which, as it should have been, was an issue where Thor faced off against Surtur in a massive battle, worthy of a 400th issue. And we had Avengers 300, which was an Inferno crossover, which took the entirety of the 300th issue and turned it into a throwaway story about the Inferno. So there you go.
Less great.
Such is the way of it.
Less great.
Vision Quest by Byrne resulted in the White Vision. So if you watched the Scarlet Witch TV show, and at the end you have the White Vision, that is actually something that was in the comics starting in 1989. This is also the year Byrne started his much-loved She-Hulk series, the one where she knows she's in a comic book. And that was sort of the basis for how we've sort of thought about She-Hulk as a character ever since. So Byrne returned this year, really got into his groove, and immediately was on like 9 series. He did West Coast Avengers, and he did the Scarlet Witch and Vision miniseries, and he did this She-Hulk. It's crazy. We also had the first Jim Lee X-Men issue. He filled in on issue 248. He's going to take over soon, but that was the first time that those two peanut butter and chocolate sort of deliciousness came together. And so we're going to see starting next year that, or I guess the year after he'll take over officially, that this becomes a pretty big thing. I'm not going to bother mentioning New Warriors.
Okay.
So.
All right. So what about new series? We obviously, you said 167 books. There's probably some new stuff in there, not just from titles that are presumably going to be ongoing, but limited as well. What are some of the standout things you want to talk about with regards to new books?
76 new titles, Dwayne. 76.
Oh, God.
What did I do to deserve this? So, but from that, there's about 10 of them that actually lasted for a while. A new version of What If debuted that went for 115 issues. We had Quasar, which is essentially about a kid who takes on some magical space gauntlets and turns into a superhero. That went for 60 issues. A book you are already familiar with, Mark Spector Moon Knight, 60 wonderful issues. So,
yes.
Sensational She-Hulk also went 60 issues, which means if they started and had regular publishing, Quasar, Mark Spector, and Sensational She-Hulk will start and end in the exact same month. So that's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Avengers West Coast debuted. Nick Fury, and it went 55 issues. Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., 47. And then we have a drop. Clive Barker's Hellraiser and Avengers Spotlight went 20 issues. Punisher Magazine and Nth Man, The Ultimate Ninja, went 16. And then Destroyer went 9, and something called Interface, which I don't even know what that is, went 8. So there's a few pretty good hits, though. Anytime you're going 50 issues, which we had 6 books that went 47 or more issues, that's like a 5-year run.
Yeah.
I think there's nothing wrong with that.
And I mean, like the Mark Spector Moon Knight, that 60 issues is like the longest run that he's had, from what I recall.
Yes, absolutely. By quite a bit, actually, I think. The 38 is the next highest. So
right. So yeah, so some pretty good series that had some staying power. What about limited series? What were some of the standouts as far as ones that were predefined to end presumably in 1989 or 1990?
So there were a bunch of them, but I mean the Damage Control one, which basically is like cleanup on Isle Marvel Universe, was one that was pretty interesting. It's about that actually has come into the Spider-Man universe as well a little bit. Gru Chronicles, which is reprints of some of the old Gru. We had essentially movie things like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade adaptation. There was a number of Marvel graphic novels, some of which were pretty good. We also had Blueberry, which was a Mobius book that came over. So Marvel started reprinting. After Mobius and Stan Lee worked on the Silver Surfer book, Marvel then actually convinced him to start doing some other sort of collaborations, and they published them in the Epic line or later just in the Marvel line. But really, I think that most of them were relatively forgettable. Probably the craziest and most interesting, if not best, miniseries was Stray Toasters, which was absolutely nuts.
What is Stray Toasters?
So Stray Toasters, it's illustrated by Bill Sienkiewicz. It looks really cool, but it essentially is about a psychologist investigating a serial killer, and everything is just crazy. But it's a bit of almost like a film noir type of mystery, but with all of the psychedelia that is Bill Sienkiewicz.
Sienkiewicz. Ah, gotcha. Okay, that explains it. That does explain it. Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds weird, but probably pretty cool to look at, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm. That is an excellent description of the whole thing. But I enjoyed it, actually.
What about new characters? We've seen kind of a lull on like really good sort of characters that end up being mainstays. Is this another one of those years, or do we start to see some characters that end up having some staying power?
So I'm just going to read this list and see who, those of you out there, listeners, who would you pick as like the top 3 or 4? I believe there's one. I'm going to give you Jubilee, who has been relatively renowned. She's not by any means the top character in the Marvel Universe. She's never had her own movie, but somebody a lot of people have heard of. But outside of that, the ones I identified are Agent, Rick Mason, Alley Viper, Angler, Prince Baron, Blackheart, Bloodscream, Carrion, also known as Malcolm McBride, Andrew Cord, Crossbones, Crystal Ball, Darklon, Dogfight, Lon the Sorcerer, Madman, Matsuoi Trisyaba, Midnight, Misfit, Numinous, Elfie Omegan, Perrin, Portal, Powderkeg, Red Guardian, Roughhouse, Shadowmasters, Shockwave, Shotgun, Silver Fox, Alisand, Voltor, and Whiteout. Oh, and Worm.
Not a fantastic list, but there's some names I recognize.
There's 3 of them, I think, that are additional to Jubilee, people who've been around quite a bit. Crossbones from Captain America, Midnight from Mark Spector, and then Red Guardian. And outside of that, it's a really thin list. And none of those guys are A-listers.
No.
So it's a very poor year for new characters in the Marvel Universe.
See, it seems weird. Well, I guess it doesn't seem weird because we've seen this now several years in a row, but it just feels like, I don't know, it feels like there should be more. Like it feels like there should be.
New characters being generated?
Yeah.
Yes. There should be.
We're, as long as we're in agreement on that.
The other thing is, keep in mind that if somebody had really gone all in on Angler from Quasar, or Madman or Lon the Sorcerer, maybe they could have turned them into an A-list villain or hero, right? Sure. But the idea is that, especially during this time, these characters were created to serve a particular role, and then the idea was they were still building up all the characters they already had for IP, not concentrating on, making sure that essentially, I don't know, Carrion gets to come back every 6 months to build up as a big villain,
No, I guess that makes sense if you think about what's going on at Marvel because of the transition to the new owner and cutting costs and focusing on making the existing already known IP even bigger and more like across pop culture. Having giant, they're not spending bunch of time and energy bringing in new characters right now.
And to be truthful, the number of characters in the Marvel Universe right now numbers in the thousands. So how many more do you really need technically?
That is true. That is true as well. What about series that came to an end? Obviously not the limited series, but ongoing series that kind of came to their end here during 1989.
There were a lot. Considering we only had a few that started, there were like 15 that had been over a year that ended. West Coast Avengers was 47 issues. Conan the King, 36. We had DP7, Justice, Cyforce, Strike Force Morituri, all that ended at 31 or 32, with that number 32 in a 32-issue miniseries type of thing going on. G.I. Joe Special Missions, Muppet Babies, Care Bears, Solo Avengers, Star Brand, Punisher Magazine, G.I. Joe European Missions, Tales of G.I. Joe, and Spider-Man Comics Magazine had all been going for over a year and were canceled. And Flintstone Kids, Speedball, Nom Magazine, Bullwinkle and Rocky, Semper Dr. Zero, Powerline, St. George, Martial Law, Freddy Krueger's A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Elf Comics Magazine all ended at less than a year. It's pretty crazy. So like 25 or more.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Books ending. Which when you make as many new ones, but a lot of them now are miniseries or one-shots. So to have this many ongoing series end in 1 year was... You could see they were making some changes, and this is where a lot of those cuts in writers and in books came in, is they were shedding things, especially that were not their IP. Because increasingly, if it wasn't something that they could sell the character licensing on, Perlman and the Marvel heads didn't care about making comic books. They cared about making licensable IP.
Sense.
Which is weird because for a long time, the most profitable part of Marvel Comics was the comic books. And now, these folks who are buying this have no interest in the comic business. They just want the less profitable side of it at the point, which is all of the licensing. And they're going to then turn that around, obviously, and make the licensing the one that's leading the dog.
Sure. So what does that mean for the bullpen then? We obviously had cost-cutting things that were going on. What are we seeing as far as creator credits and editor-in-chief and all that?
So the size of the staff ballooned to 489 people. And I think that might be that there were more folks who were brought in on short-term contracts and things like this, less full-time staff, less people on full contracts. Tom DeFalco is still the editor-in-chief. He's adding now what he calls assistant editor classes to try and help some of his folks get up on editing, probably because they need more and more editors. DeFalco is also starting to lose people. due to arguments, because he is angering especially some of the older guys, Engleharts and stuff like that, who'd been angered before, or some of these folks, Byrne, I think, where he has sort of that my way or the highway attitude on a few things, and so we're starting to see a little bit of that going on. Stan's soapbox returned, which was cool. So Stan Lee is now back writing a soapbox for DC, or is back writing a soapbox for Marvel Comics, which is nice to see. But the size of the overall virtual bullpen is huge right now.
That's amazingly large. I can't even.
A lot of it is the adaptations and the kids comics, because kid comics sometimes have 8 or 10 different stories in them, and a lot of times they're done by different people. So the credits are just fantastically expanded on those books over something that's like a Daredevil with 4 or 5 creators on it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, so Rookie of the Year. Who are the new people, and who are we giving the award to for Marvel Rookie of the Year for 1989?
So I have 4 names to at least mention. There were over 100 people who were new at Marvel this year, but the 4 I'd like to at least note are Greg Capullo did his first work for Marvel this year. Maybe one of the coolest people in comics. He is. He looks kind of like he would be, the lead guitarist of a metal band, and he has been on, like tattoo television shows and stuff like this. He also is one of the most fantastic artists in the world. But he started out on X-Force. He then moved off and went to Image and drew Spawn for McFarlane when McFarlane decided to stop drawing it. And then he has since done a lot of work on Batman over at DC. And him and Scott Snyder have had some pretty fantastic runs on that. But Capullo is just an amazing artist. He hasn't done a whole lot in Marvel, but really is. It's interesting because he may have been the best artist working at Marvel when Image decided to leave, and they left him behind instead of taking him with, which I think was an error. They should have brought him along with them as well. Or maybe McFarlane knew that he wanted to just get him to draw for him later, so he didn't want him as an Image partner. He wanted him as an employee. So, anyway. We also had Scott McDaniel, who we're going to see. He's got a 3-year run coming up on Daredevil here soon as the artist. He also did some Green Goblin work, but mostly he is a DC guy. Kurt Busiek actually started out with one of the biggest effects on the Marvel Universe you can imagine as a kid with a fan theory. So he is, if you remember we talked about this a while ago, the kid who had the theory that if you wanted to bring back Jean Grey, you could do it by just saying that the Phoenix never really inhabited Jean Grey, but instead the Phoenix took her form and Jean was actually just away in a cocoon someplace. And then, oh, look, she's back, and now she's not tainted with the death of the 6 million people. That was actually him. And then eventually he got a chance to write. So he co-created the Thunderbolts. He worked on Avengers with George Perez. And one of the stories actually they did there was the Kang Dynasty storyline, which was going to be adapted into the MCU with the next series of movies.
Yeah.
So Busiek is somebody who definitely would be a pretty decent choice as a Rookie of the Year. But I'm going to go... This is actually my last chance to choose at least one of the Image co-creators as a Rookie of the Year. And I feel that maybe it's time. So would I have believed that I would be choosing Rob Liefeld as a Rookie of the Year, but not Jim Lee? No. I'm as shocked as anybody about this. But Liefeld had his debut this year. And he's actually going to go on to co-create Cable and Deadpool. Both of them are going to be very important characters. Every $1 billion movie, Deadpool becomes a little bit more important to the history of Marvel.
Yep.
Now, I think that a lot of the things that make Deadpool, later people maybe help to layer on. But nonetheless, you got to give him credit for that. He left for Image in 1992. and spend a long time doing his own thing. But one thing about him, as opposed to some of the other Image folks, is he has come back to Marvel every once in a while and has been the regular penciler on Deadpool things and has participated in the Marvel Universe even going forward. So even though he has not maybe been active with Marvel all the time, I think you have to say he had a pretty substantial effect on the Marvel Cinematic Universe by creating Cable and Deadpool. And just overall, his style, that sort of over-the-top, frenetic, super violent, super kinetic style, is going to be something that the entire 90s comic scene basically picks up on. And so he is really an important influence on all of comics and definitely on Marvel. When you look at those Moon Knight books over the next 60 issues, by the end of them, the imprint of Rob Liefeld is absolutely impossible to miss. So, Stephen Platt and his crazy massive chests and tiny limbs and everything like that. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah, no, I remember that. I remember that.
That's
definitely.
That's 100% out of the world of Liefeld.
One of the issues in the 50s when. Yeah, that was like one of my favorite covers of Moon Knight. Was
crazy,
that,
but beautiful.
Yeah. All right.
So he's got a career awash in controversy and conflict and all sorts of craziness. But I think that he is definitely going to be my Rookie of the Year for the year.
He's the guy that synonymously doesn't draw feet well, if I remember right?
He is terrible at feet. Basically, he just makes them as tiny little dead fish, and they work though. I mean, he actually doesn't. The weird thing is, it's not that he doesn't draw anything well. There's things he cares about, there's things he doesn't care about, and so he evidently just never learned to worry about feet, But his art is incredibly interesting, and that's I think why he was able to get away with whatever he needed to. But yeah, he got himself into a jeans commercial back in the day, and he has made all sorts of statements that get him in trouble with various people, and there's a million reasons to love and hate Rob Liefeld, but it's hard to deny his influence. And if you don't believe that, all you have to do is ask Rob, and he will be certain to tell you why he is so important to the industry.
There we go. Well, congratulations to Rob Liefeld on his Rookie of the Year for 1989. Before we jump in and start talking about Daredevil, Dan, what was your favorite Marvel book this year?
So despite some of the craziness of these, I actually really liked the Inferno crossover. So I'm going to go with Inferno for this year. I actually liked one of the crossovers. I almost always hate the crossovers, so I'm going to give this one props. I thought it was fun.
Bang.
Hey, this is Dan from the Editing Bay. Well, as you might have noticed by the fact that your time is about ending, we are splitting this one into two parts, kind of as we discussed what we're going to do a little bit earlier. Again, we'd love to hear from you guys as to whether this is a way that you're okay with getting the episodes. But for 1989, because we ran over 2 hours, we are going to do this first half talking about comics and what happened at Marvel this week, and then next week, Dwayne and I will return to talk about what our old friend Daredevil has been up to this year. So, we'll see you all next week. Thanks. Have a great one, folks.
That's going to put a wrap on this week's show. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts about this week's show. You can send those to us via email at comments@comicsovertime.com or via Twitter or Blue Sky. We're at Comics Over Time there. Until next week, take care, everybody.